What if the greatest civilization you've never heard of was the one that laid the foundation for Rome, the empire that would rule the world? The Etruscans, whose cities ruled central Italy long before Rome even existed, disappeared without a trace. But in their shadow, every stone of Rome's triumphs was built. Their secrets, their innovations, and their cultural brilliance left echoes that would shape the future for millennia. Who were the Etruscans, and how did they rise, dominate, and vanish, leaving behind only fragments of their civilization, fragments that are still unlocking mysteries about our past?
What if the greatest civilization you've never heard of was the one that laid the foundation for Rome, the empire that would rule the world? The Etruscans, whose cities ruled central Italy long before Rome even existed, disappeared without a trace, but in their shadow, every stone of Rome's triumphs was built. Their secrets, their innovations, and their cultural brilliance left echoes that would shape the future for millennia. Who were the Etruscans, and how did they rise, dominate, and vanish, leaving behind only fragments of their civilization, fragments that are still unlocking mysteries about our past? Now, before you scroll away, let me ask you, how will this story end for you? You've already seen the beginning. Don't miss the rest. Subscribe now and be part of the journey. Because the Etruscan story, like all stories that matter, will stay with you. But only if you're here to see it unfold.
Imagine this. Beneath these hills, volcanoes once raged, their fury shaping the land and the people who would rise from it. But even in the face of this fire, the Etruscans built. They thrived. They dominated. But then, they vanished, leaving only ruins and secrets that have haunted us for centuries. The land that birthed the Etruscans was not merciful. It was forged by fire, where the earth was as volatile as the people who lived upon it. Central Italy, where the very mountains were alive, teeming with molten fury beneath the surface, was the birthplace of a people who built their civilization not on the fertile plains of the Nile or the Tigris and Euphrates, but on jagged hills, steep and inaccessible. These hills were not just a home, they were a battlefield. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and the constant threat of invasion made survival here a brutal test of will. And yet, it was in this very crucible that the Etruscans rose to power, crafting not just weapons and tools, but a new world of art, religion, and influence.
The very earth beneath their feet was alive with precious resources, iron, copper, silver. But it was more than raw wealth. It was a source of strength and invention. They were the first in Italy to master metallurgy, forging not just weapons, but also their destiny. Their people became known for their advanced skills in metalworking, producing art that would become as much a symbol of their society as their legendary tombs. But the Etruscans didn't just live for this world. They feared the next. Their tombs were not just resting places, they were gateways to the afterlife, filled with treasures and rituals that baffled even their closest neighbors. Yet, amid all this power and wealth, there is a mystery that remains unsolved: their language. They left behind a script, a written language, and yet we still can't read it. Their words remain a cryptic puzzle, a symbol of a civilization that flourished and then vanished without leaving a full trace. How can a people so advanced leave behind a code that still stumps the greatest minds of modern scholarship? The Etruscans had a system of writing, but it's not like anything we know today. The letters are similar to Greek, but their meanings remain locked in silence. Some of their writings were ritualistic, tied to their religion. Others might have been practical. But what does it mean when a civilization leaves us with a record that we can't read?
They built monumental cities, their wealth unmatched, their influence on Rome undeniable. Yet, as Rome rose to power, the Etruscans were slowly crushed beneath the weight of their own isolation. Their cities, once powerful fortresses, were slowly consumed by time and war. But there's something more, something far darker in their story. The fall of the Etruscans was not just a matter of military conquest, it was something more insidious, a slow unraveling. And the final twist? The last remnants of their power weren't defeated, they were co-opted. The Romans didn't just conquer the Etruscans, they inherited them. But at what cost? In the early dawn of time, when the world was still young, the land of central Italy was a battleground, a place of fire, stone, and untamed ambition. It was here, beneath the shadow of the craggy hills and alongside the volatile volcanic soils, that the Villanovans emerged, small farming communities, seemingly insignificant, yet destined to change the course of history. But their rise was not a mere accident of fate. It was born from the very flames of the earth itself. For centuries, these people lived quietly on the fringes of the known world. Their lives were simple, dominated by the endless cycles of planting and harvesting. They weren't just surviving, they were learning to read the language of the earth, to understand its secrets. And it was these secrets that would turn their world upside down.
The key to their transformation lay in the earth itself. Beneath their feet, hidden in the volcanic soil, was a treasure unlike any they had ever seen: copper and tin. What began as a simple discovery would set in motion the rise of an entirely new civilization. By mixing tin with copper, the Villanovans birthed bronze, the first true metal tools in the region. But this wasn't just a technological advancement. This was a game changer. The discovery of bronze was the spark that would ignite a revolution in every aspect of life. With these tools, the Villanovans began to reshape not only their world, but their very social order. No longer would wealth and power be defined by the number of cattle or acres of land one owned. With bronze, power was measured by control over the earth itself, the ability to transform raw materials into something far greater. The Villanovans' mastery of metalworking was not merely a practical achievement, it was symbolic. Bronze was an alloy that held power. It was the product of fire, of alchemy, of transformation. They didn't just create tools, they created the foundation for their dominance. Weapons, tools, and even ritual objects forged from bronze became symbols of social status, power, and wealth. But how did these small farming communities, living in the shadow of an unpredictable land, harness such power? How did the discovery of bronze lead them to carve out a new world from the earth itself? The answer lies not in their tools, but in their geography. The Villanovans chose to build their cities atop the very hills that had once been an obstacle to their survival. But these steep, rocky fortresses would become their greatest advantage. The landscape itself offered them protection, shelter, and a strategic position that allowed them to thrive in isolation. Here, on these windswept peaks, they built cities, not just for survival, but for strength. They didn't just build cities, they built fortresses. Each city was a carefully crafted stronghold, designed to withstand not only the threat of natural disaster, but also the encroaching forces of rival tribes, and eventually, the growing might of Rome. The Villanovans understood that their survival was no longer about farming alone. It was about mastering their surroundings and protecting their power. In this new world of bronze and fire, a new class of leaders emerged. These were not merely chiefs, they were rulers, bound by the power of metal. They wore bronze masks, adorned their bodies with intricate jewelry, and wielded bronze swords in ceremonies that signified not only military might, but also divine favor. It's important to understand that the Villanovans weren't just living in a time of technological revolution, they were living in a world of belief. The metal they worked with wasn't just a resource, it was a connection to the divine. Bronze was sacred, it was tied to rituals, and the leaders who controlled the bronze controlled the fate of their people. But with this newfound power came an unspoken truth. The Villanovans were at the edge of something much greater. With metal in their hands and wealth in their coffers, they were beginning to build a world not just of survival, but of dominance. And that would bring them into contact with forces far beyond their control. But no empire, no matter how powerful, lasts forever. The Villanovans' dominance in central Italy was soon challenged by a rising force that would consume everything they had built. The question is, did they see it coming? Did they foresee their fall? Or was it their isolation and fear of the outside world that would be their undoing? As the Villanovans' power grew, so too did the envy and ambition of their neighbors. Yet despite their technological prowess, they were not immune to the forces of time, war, and nature. A new civilization, far more powerful and ruthless, was making its way across the plains of Italy. The Romans, young, hungry, and driven by an ambition they could not yet contain, were coming.
The rise of Rome did not happen in a vacuum. It was the influence of the Etruscans that gave the Romans the military and political tools to dominate the Italian peninsula. What we often forget is that the Etruscans were pivotal in teaching the Romans how to govern, how to fight, and how to grow their empire. But as the Romans learned, the Etruscans began to fade. The very things that made them powerful, metal, wealth, fortification, became their downfall. For the Romans had one thing the Etruscans did not: unity. Rome was a city, but soon it would become an empire. What happened to the Etruscans? What happened to a people who mastered the very earth beneath their feet? The answers lie buried beneath the ruins, hidden within the tombs of their kings, waiting to be uncovered. But perhaps the greatest mystery of all is not their fall, but what they left behind and what the Romans would later claim as their own.
What if the greatest civilization you've never heard of was the one that laid the foundations for Rome, the empire that would rule the world? And what if I told you that this civilization, the Etruscans, vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the faintest whispers of their power and influence? Their cities were grand, their culture advanced, yet their true story remains locked in silence. By 600 BCE, the Etruscans had built one of the most powerful confederations in the ancient world. 12 city-states, each independent yet united by culture, religion, and military might, formed the Etruscan League. These cities were more than just fortresses. They were the heartbeat of central Italy, controlling trade, forging alliances, and dictating the political landscape. But how did these city-states, once isolated in the hills, come to dominate the Italian peninsula? And what caused them to vanish so completely? The Etruscan Confederation was not a monarchy or a single empire. It was a loose alliance of 12 city-states, each governed by a council of elites. But this system, seemingly fragile, was held together by a powerful combination of religion and military strength. The key to the Etruscan Confederation's success lay in the role of religion.
Unlike the Greeks and Romans, whose political systems were driven by the will of the people or kings, the Etruscans' decisions were often influenced by their religious leaders. Priests, wielding divine authority, had as much power as military generals. The sacred and the military were inseparable in the Etruscan worldview.
The military and religious authorities in Etruscan cities worked hand in hand. Priests performed rituals before battles, ensuring divine favor, and generals made sure that their military strategies were aligned with religious prophecy. This unique fusion of power and belief created a system that was both highly organized and deeply spiritual. The Etruscans were pioneers in military innovation. They developed advanced weaponry, including iron swords and spears, and mastered the use of chariots in warfare. But their real military edge came from their well-coordinated tactics, which were guided by a combination of practical knowledge and religious ritual. When an Etruscan army marched into battle, they did so with the belief that they were not just soldiers, but divine instruments of power. But the Etruscans were not just warriors. They were also the cultural bridges between East and West. Through trade with the Greeks and Phoenicians, they brought Eastern influences to Italy, changing the cultural and artistic landscape forever. Yet they also infused these influences with their own unique vision. Etruscan art reflects the fusion of Eastern and local traditions. While they borrowed heavily from the Greeks, their art is uniquely Etruscan, particularly in their tomb frescoes and bronze work. Their artworks didn't just serve as decoration, they were symbols of power, wealth, and belief. It was their art that communicated their identity to both their people and their enemies.
Through their control of Mediterranean trade routes, the Etruscans became intermediaries between the great cultures of the East and the emerging powers of the West. They were not just conquerors, they were diplomats, traders, and cultural intermediaries, masters at negotiation, who forged alliances across the Mediterranean. But even the mightiest confederation could not stand forever. As Rome grew in power and ambition, the Etruscans began to feel the pressure. What had once been a powerful alliance of city-states began to crack. The Romans, once influenced by Etruscan religion and military strategies, now turned their eyes on Etruscan lands. The Etruscans had created something remarkable, a confederation that was strong, unified, and prosperous. But over time, their unity began to falter. Internal rivalries, shifting political alliances, and the growing power of Rome slowly undermined their once mighty empire. Rome's ambition to control the Italian peninsula and beyond was a force that the Etruscans could not withstand. The story of the Etruscans is not just one of power, but also of loss. Their cities, once united in strength and purpose, began to fracture under the weight of Roman expansion. Yet even as their political dominance crumbled, their influence remained woven into the very fabric of Rome itself. As the Etruscans fell, they left behind a legacy not just in their art, but in the very foundations of Rome. From their military strategies to their religious rites, the Romans inherited more than just territory. They inherited a culture. And in doing so, the Etruscans ensured that even in defeat, they would never truly disappear. But the question remains, how much did Rome truly take from the Etruscans, and how much did they leave behind? What secrets of the Etruscans are still waiting to be uncovered? Beneath the earth, buried in the hills of ancient Italy, lies a civilization whose legacy still haunts us today. A people whose creations in bronze, stone, and art would outlast time itself.
But as the echoes of their art ring through the ages, one question remains. Why did a society so advanced, so rich in culture, fade into obscurity? And what can their art tell us about who they were? The Etruscans were masters of metal, but they weren't just blacksmiths, they were artists. Their bronze mirrors, ornate jewelry, and religious artifacts were not merely functional, they were manifestations of their beliefs, their fears, and their desires for immortality. With every stroke of the chisel, every flame of the forge, they crafted a world that transcended their own. For the Etruscans, metal was more than a tool, it was a sacred medium. From their intricate bronze mirrors to their meticulously designed weapons, every creation was a link to the gods, a connection to the divine order. These weren't just practical objects, they were ritualistic artifacts meant to carry spiritual meaning and power.
What makes Etruscan metalwork so fascinating is the way they blended functionality with artistry. Their shields, for example, were not only military tools, they were deeply symbolic, decorated with gods like Tinia, their supreme deity. It's clear that the Etruscans didn't just think of art as decoration. For them, it was a way of engaging with the divine, of bringing the gods into their lives through every aspect of their culture. The Etruscans' skill with metalworking was unparalleled in their time. The weapons they forged weren't simply for war, they were adorned with religious symbols, meant to invoke divine favor. These objects, bound by both form and function, carried the power of the gods wherever they went. But the Etruscans didn't just create art for their daily lives, they created it for the gods. Their temples, built with monumental columns and intricate carvings, were not merely places of worship, they were cosmic gateways to the divine. Every wall was adorned with vibrant paintings, each brushstroke a divine offering, each image a prayer for favor in both life and death. In their tombs, the Etruscans created worlds of art, depicting not just life, but the afterlife. The tombs, like the temples, were not simply burial sites, they were artistic arenas, where the deceased could enter the next world surrounded by beauty, music, and divine protection. They painted their tombs with vivid murals, telling stories of feasts, dances, and sacrifices to the gods, offering a glimpse into the world they believed awaited them.
But the Etruscan influence didn't stop at their own borders. The Romans, who later conquered the Etruscans, didn't just inherit their land. They inherited their art, their architecture, and their engineering. The arches that would become Roman symbols of power, Etruscan. The road systems, the urban planning, even the use of the civic calendar all had roots in Etruscan traditions. The Etruscans were masters of urban planning. Their cities were not just military fortresses, they were designed with public spaces, roads, and civic centers that would later influence Roman city designs. In fact, the very concept of using arches in large-scale construction came from the Etruscans, who understood how to distribute weight and create stable, enduring structures. What the Romans inherited from the Etruscans wasn't just architectural skill, it was an entire cultural framework. From their religious practices to their urban innovations, Rome was built on the shoulders of a civilization that never received the recognition it deserved. Yet for all their achievements, the Etruscans remain one of history's greatest mysteries. Their language, though recorded, is still largely unreadable. Their culture, rich with art and religious significance, has left us with more questions than answers. What were the true meanings behind their art? Why was their language left so incomplete? And most chilling of all, why did they vanish so suddenly, leaving no trace of their true legacy? The Etruscan story is not one of defeat, but of disappearance. A civilization so rich in art, power, and divine connection, yet so fragile that it slipped through the cracks of time. But the questions remain. What secrets are buried in their tombs? What knowledge did they possess that we have yet to uncover? Imagine a civilization where every political decision, every military campaign, and every piece of art was guided by the divine. What if I told you that the fate of this mighty people was shaped not by the strength of their armies, but by the entrails of a sacrificed animal, the flight patterns of birds, and the crackling of lightning? A civilization that believed their very survival depended on the will of the gods, and yet they vanished without a trace. The Etruscans weren't just a culture obsessed with the divine, they were a society shaped by it. Their entire civilization, from art to warfare, was built upon the rituals that allowed them to communicate with the gods. But what did this reliance on the divine truly cost? And why, despite their devotion, did their empire crumble under the weight of their own divine power? At the heart of Etruscan power was their priesthood. Unlike the kings and generals who fought wars and made alliances, the priests were the true rulers. Why? Because they held the keys to the gods. It was they who interpreted the divine signs, sacred omens drawn from animal entrails, from bird flight, from the thunderous cracks of lightning itself.
In Etruscan society, the priesthood wasn't just a religious office, it was a political one. The most important decisions, from military campaigns to alliances with neighboring cities, were made not by generals, but by diviners who interpreted the will of the gods. It wasn't uncommon for kings to consult priests before they made any major decision. The gods were their ultimate advisors, and their favor or wrath could determine the fate of the Etruscan state. Every military campaign, every political alliance, every moment of peace or war was weighed in the divine balance. The entrails of sacrificed animals, the patterns of bird flight, and the strikes of lightning were not just omens, they were divine commands. The kings and warriors of Etruria weren't just fighting for their people, they were fighting for the favor of the gods. But could the gods be trusted to guide them to victory? And if the gods turned against them, what then? In Etruscan society, the gods were not remote figures. They weren't abstract ideas or concepts. They were real, present, active participants in every facet of life. Gods like Tinia, the god of the sky, and Uni, the goddess of marriage and fertility, were not just worshipped, they were consulted before every major action. They were the ones who decided who would rule, who would fight, and who would live. Etruscan art isn't just about the aesthetic, it's about communication with the divine. Their paintings, sculptures, and artifacts weren't just decorations, they were prayers, offerings, and divine declarations. The murals in the tombs, depicting feasts and rituals, were not only designed to honor the dead, they were created to ensure the favor of the gods in the afterlife. The gods were as much a part of the physical world as they were of the spiritual. But the gods' favor didn't come without sacrifice. Every action required a divine transaction, a commitment to the god's will. Sacrifices, rituals, and divinations were not simply acts of worship, they were acts of power. And when the gods spoke, the Etruscans listened. But what happens when the gods stop answering? As the Etruscan cities began to fracture, so too did their faith. The once unshakable trust in the gods began to waver. The signs, once so clear and so constant, became confused. What had been a civilization ruled by the gods became one at war with itself, divided by political strife and external threats.
The Etruscans believed their gods were guiding them. But as their political system became more unstable, their divination practices became less reliable. When the gods no longer seemed to favor them, the priests lost their credibility, and the power of the king was called into question. The downfall of the Etruscans can be traced not only to their political fragility, but to a crisis of faith. When the gods stopped answering, the Etruscans stopped believing. And with that loss of faith
came their downfall. The Romans, the very people who had once learned from the Etruscans, inherited their gods, their rituals, and their art. But the gods had abandoned Etruria long before Rome rose to power. The Etruscan gods may have vanished from the earth, but their story is far from over. For their sacred texts, their divination practices, and their rituals remain locked away, waiting to be deciphered. The question remains, did the Etruscans fall because their gods abandoned them, or because they simply could not hear the divine will anymore? The gods may have been silent, but their legacy is not. The answers lie buried in the ancient tombs, the sacred temples, and the unreadable texts. The Etruscans may be gone, but their story is far from finished. In 396 BCE, a turning point in history was sealed in the fiery ruins of an Etruscan city, a city that had once been invincible. They, a powerful Etruscan stronghold, fell to the Romans after a long siege that marked the beginning of the end for an entire civilization. The question is, how did a people, masters of art, religion, and warfare, succumb to a rival that had only begun to flex its muscles? For centuries, the Etruscans had ruled over the heart of Italy. Their cities were powerful, their armies feared, and their culture sophisticated. Yet by the 5th century BCE, a new power was on the rise, Rome. And while Rome was still a small city-state, its military innovations and fierce ambition began to chip away at the mighty Etruscans. It wasn't just their army that made Rome dangerous, it was their ability to adapt and innovate, something the Etruscans failed to do. By the time Rome started to pose a serious threat, the Etruscans were already divided. What had once been a cohesive civilization, united by culture and religion, now stood fractured. Internal political strife, rivalries, and an over-reliance on outdated systems had weakened them. The unity that had once made them a formidable force was now their greatest liability. The Etruscan League, once a powerful alliance of city-states, could no longer unite against a common enemy. There was no central government to coordinate their defense. Each city was more concerned with maintaining its own power than with the survival of the civilization as a whole. This political fragmentation made them incredibly vulnerable to external threats, especially from the Romans, who were growing stronger with every year.
The failure of the Etruscans to unify against Rome would prove catastrophic. But what was it about Rome that made it such a dangerous opponent? Was it simply military might, or was there something more? The answer lies in the Roman approach to war, an innovation that left the Etruscans scrambling to catch up. Rome didn't just have a growing army, they had a new kind of army. By the 5th century BCE, the Romans had perfected the manipular legion, a military system that was more flexible, more mobile, and better adapted to complex battlefield scenarios than anything the Etruscans had. The Romans didn't just fight, they innovated. The manipular legion was revolutionary. Instead of the rigid, inflexible phalanx that many ancient armies used, the Roman soldiers were organized into smaller units that could maneuver independently. This flexibility allowed them to adapt to changing battle conditions. The Etruscans, by contrast, were still using traditional, outdated tactics that were less effective against the Roman legions. It wasn't just about numbers, it was about strategy. The Etruscans were slow to adapt to new military tactics, relying on ancient formations that left them vulnerable. Rome's adaptability and discipline in battle were unmatched, and their rise to power was built on these innovations. But the fall of Veii wasn't just about military prowess, it was a psychological blow. The Etruscans had no idea how to respond to this new, efficient force.
In 396 BCE, after years of relentless siege, Veii, the Etruscans' greatest stronghold,
finally fell to the Romans. It was a defeat that shook the Etruscan world to its core. Once the heart of the Etruscan League, Veai's collapse marked the beginning of the end for the Etruscan civilization. The Romans had won, and nothing would ever be the same. The fall of Veii was a game-changer for Rome. It wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. The Romans had proven they could defeat the Etruscans, and after that there was no turning back. It marked a major turning point in Roman history, as it provided them with a new base from which to expand. The Romans now had the upper hand, and the Etruscans were divided, unable to mount a unified defense. But what happened next was perhaps the most tragic part of the story. The Etruscans did not just fall to an external threat, they fell to their own fractured society. The Romans did not just conquer Etruscan lands, they absorbed their culture, their religion, and their military strategies. The Etruscans, once the undisputed rulers of central Italy, were now relegated to the history books. But the most haunting question remains: could they have saved themselves? If their city-states had united, if their leaders had seen the looming threat of Rome for what it was, could the Etruscans have fought back? Or was their fate sealed the moment their unity broke down?
It's difficult to say. Had the Etruscans been able to unite, there's a chance they could have repelled the Romans. But the reality is that the internal political fragmentation and lack of unity doomed them. They didn't just lose to Rome, they lost to themselves. The Etruscans had mastered the art of warfare, of diplomacy, and of religion. But in the end, it was their inability to unite that led to their downfall. And as the Roman legions marched across their once proud lands, the Etruscans' greatest mistake was not in underestimating their enemies, but in underestimating the power of unity. The Etruscans are gone, but their story, their power, and their fate live on. The question is, what can we learn from their rise and their fall? What happens when a civilization, once invincible, is erased from the map of history, but not from the memory of the victor? The Etruscans, the masters of the Italian heartland, were not simply defeated, they were absorbed, transformed, and even forgotten. Their fall wasn't just the loss of territory, it was the loss of their legacy, which, paradoxically, lived on in the very empire that destroyed them. Rome's rise was not only a result of its military might, it was a result of what it inherited. While the Etruscans may have fallen, their essence permeated the heart of Rome. But how much of Rome's power was shaped by the very civilization it conquered? Was Rome truly a creation of its own, or a reflection of a culture it consumed and made its own?
The Romans didn't just borrow from the Etruscans. They fundamentally shaped their own spiritual and political systems around Etruscan practices. The concept of divine will, consulting the gods before making decisions, was first fully realized by the Etruscans. The Roman augurs, their religious practices, and their political rituals were all heavily influenced by Etruscan traditions. What we often overlook is how much of Roman political life was dictated by the Etruscan systems of divination. Roman emperors, senators, and military generals didn't just follow their own instincts, they followed the will of the gods, as interpreted by Etruscan-trained priests. Haruspicy, the practice of reading animal entrails to predict the future, was directly passed down from Etruscan rites. But why did Rome cling so tightly to these practices? Was it because the gods truly guided them? Or because Rome, in its ambition, feared losing the divine favor the Etruscans once had? The power of the gods was woven into the fabric of Rome's greatness. But did the gods ever truly favor Rome? Or was it all a calculated game of divine manipulation? The Romans are often credited with creating the architectural wonders of the ancient world: grand temples,
theaters, and aqueducts. But what many don't realize is that Rome's architectural brilliance was built upon the shoulders of the Etruscans. The Etruscans perfected the use of the arch and the vault, innovations that allowed for grand structures and more advanced urban planning. And the Romans? They didn't invent these techniques, they perfected them.
The Romans were masters of monumental architecture, but the Etruscans had already laid the groundwork. The use of arches, vaults, and even the layout of Roman streets and aqueducts came from Etruscan urban planning. The Etruscans may have fallen, but their understanding of engineering lived on in the very foundations of Rome. But what does it mean for an empire to rise on the back of the culture it destroyed? Was Rome truly an innovator? Or was it merely the heir to a civilization that it erased from the history books? Rome's military genius is legendary, but it didn't emerge out of thin air. The Etruscans, known for their advanced cavalry and tactical formations, influenced Roman military strategies. The use of cavalry, chariots, and even the way the Romans organized their legions stemmed from Etruscan practices. The Romans didn't just conquer, they adapted and innovated based on lessons learned from the Etruscans. The Roman legions are often hailed as the most effective fighting force in history, but the Etruscans influenced that success. Roman soldiers were trained in the tactics that the Etruscans perfected, including their use of cavalry. The Roman army evolved these tactics to fit their own needs, but they never forgot where the lessons came from. But how much of Roman greatness was built on what the Etruscans had already mastered? Was Rome's empire truly their own, or was it built on the borrowed strength of those they conquered? The Etruscans may have lost their land, their cities, and their sovereignty, but in the heart of Rome, their legacy still beats. The influence of their gods, their military, and their culture flows through the veins of the Roman Empire. But the question remains, was Rome's greatness truly its own, or did it rise on the shoulders of those it destroyed and erased from history? And as Rome expanded, did they honor the Etruscan legacy, or did they erase it, rewriting history to fit their own narrative? The answers are hidden in plain sight in the very structures, rituals, and strategies that built Rome. But the truth may be more unsettling than we can imagine.
For millennia, they were lost to history, forgotten by time, erased by the rise of Rome. But beneath the earth, in the forgotten tombs of Tarquinia and Cerveteri, a hidden world lies waiting to be rediscovered. What if the history of Rome, the empire that would dominate the known world, wasn't born of its own genius, but built on the foundations of a people they once conquered? The Etruscans didn't just influence Rome, they gave it the keys to its future. For centuries, we knew the Etruscans as a defeated people, vanquished by the Romans and left to the sands of time. But the truth? Their civilization never truly disappeared. It was buried, literally and figuratively, by the Romans themselves. And today, modern archaeologists are uncovering not just their treasures, but a legacy that rewrites the history of ancient Italy. It was here, in the Etruscan tombs, that some of the greatest treasures of the ancient world have been uncovered. These weren't just burial sites, they were time capsules, filled with the wealth and artistry of a people whose influence permeated every facet of ancient Italy. Gold jewelry, ornate pottery, and priceless frescoes have been brought to light, each piece telling a story of a civilization that wasn't simply erased, but subsumed, leaving us with the whispers of its greatness.
The tombs we're uncovering reveal a culture that valued both beauty and function. These frescoes show Etruscans in their afterlife, honoring gods and engaging in feasts. They didn't just live with the gods, they lived for the gods. This belief in an afterlife, a connection to the divine, and the importance of artistic expression were integral parts of Etruscan society. But what's most shocking isn't just the wealth of these tombs, it's the influence they wielded on the Roman elite. The religious ceremonies, the art, and even the very idea of burial as a communal, divine act were adopted by Rome, laying the groundwork for some of Rome's most lasting traditions. The Etruscans didn't just shape Roman religious practices, they shaped Roman governance. The Romans adopted the Etruscan system of kingship with the idea that rulers were divinely chosen. Early Roman monarchs, like Tarquinius Priscus, were directly descended from the Etruscan royal bloodlines, bringing with them the imperium, the divine right to rule. Rome's early kings were Etruscan, and it was during their rule that many Roman political systems were established. The concept of imperium, the divine right to rule, comes directly from Etruscan models. The Senate, which would later become the heart of Roman political power, was influenced by the Etruscan system of oligarchic rule, where a few elite families had the power to govern.
So was Rome truly a creation of its own genius? Or did the very structure of Roman politics, the foundations of its legal system, and the divine right to rule come from the very people they would one day conquer? The grandeur of Roman architecture, the arches, the public spaces, the aqueducts, wasn't born from a vacuum. It was shaped by the Etruscans, who were masters of urban planning and engineering. The Etruscans introduced the use of the arch and the vault, innovations that the Romans would perfect in the construction of their monumental structures. The very city of Rome itself, its grid layout, its aqueducts, its temples, was influenced by Etruscan design. The Romans are famous for their innovations in construction, but they were standing on the shoulders of the Etruscans. The Etruscans had already understood how to use arches and vaults to create strong, enduring structures. The Romans didn't just borrow from them, they adapted these techniques to build an empire. What happens when the foundations of one civilization, its architecture, its sacred temples, its entire city plan, are used to build an empire that erases its predecessor from history? The Romans didn't just conquer the Etruscans. They made them invisible in the pages of history, yet their legacy is etched in stone across the Roman world. The Etruscan language remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the ancient world. Thousands of inscriptions have been uncovered, yet the full meaning of these texts eludes us. Why was this language so different from others? What secrets did it hold about their society, their rulers, and their beliefs? The Etruscan language is one of the oldest and most enigmatic of the Mediterranean world. It is not related to Latin, Greek, or any other Indo-European language, making it uniquely Etruscan. Decoding it could reveal not just their worldview, but also their relationship with Rome. However, even with modern technology, much of it remains beyond our reach. What if the key to understanding the Etruscans is locked in these inscriptions waiting to be deciphered? What could we learn about a people who shaped Rome, only to be swallowed by history itself? The Etruscans may have faded from history, but their legacy is far from gone. Every new discovery, each artifact, each inscription, each tomb, reveals not just a forgotten civilization, but the shadows of a culture that helped shape the very foundation of Rome. The question remains, how much of Roman greatness was truly theirs, and how much of it was built on the bones of a people who vanished from history? The Etruscans are waiting to be heard. The question is, will we listen?
For centuries, the Etruscans were lost to time. But today, they reappear not in the history books, but in the pages of novels, blockbuster films, and graphic novels. They are portrayed as mystics, warriors, and gods. Yet how much of their true legacy has been captured? The Etruscans are not just the figments of a storyteller's imagination. They were the architects of Roman power, the creators of a civilization that we are only beginning to understand. Today, the Etruscans are often portrayed as an ancient civilization cloaked in mystery and lost to history. But behind the film sets and fictional accounts lies a culture whose impact on the ancient world and even our modern one is undeniable. But what if the Etruscans were more than just a mysterious backdrop to Roman glory? What if they were the foundation of Rome's rise to power? The Etruscans may be remembered as a mysterious civilization, but their influence on Rome cannot be overstated. Their legal codes, religious practices, and political systems laid the groundwork for Roman governance. The fasces, the symbol of Roman authority, was directly inspired by Etruscan customs, and it was the Etruscan kings who helped shape the early Roman Republic.
What people often overlook is the role of Etruscan rulers in early Roman governance. The imperium, the divine right to rule, was first established by the Etruscans, and many early Roman political structures were shaped by the Etruscan model of kingship. It wasn't just their rituals or their gods that influenced Rome. Their political organization became the foundation for Roman law and governance. But the influence of the Etruscans went far beyond politics. They were architects of Roman urban planning, military strategies, and the very design of their cities. It was the Etruscans who taught the Romans how to build with stone and create lasting monuments. They were the ones who laid the blueprints for Rome's imperial expansion. For centuries, the Etruscans were depicted as mystical, otherworldly figures shrouded in mystery. But their art, whether in frescoes, sculpture, or jewelry, tells a different story. Their art was a celebration of the divine and the human, showing not just their gods, but their daily lives, their feasts, their celebrations, and their power. Etruscan art is incredibly sophisticated. It shows a civilization that was deeply in tune with both the divine and the mundane. They didn't just create sacred images, they captured the full range of human existence. And this influence can be seen in the Roman art that followed, which drew heavily from Etruscan iconography and religious symbolism. But why has so much of this art and culture been reduced to mere mysticism in popular media? Why do we focus on the grandeur of their temples and their divine warriors and ignore the subtleties of their true artistic legacy?
For over 2,000 years, the Etruscan language remained an enigma. Unlike Greek or Latin, Etruscan was a language without a clear descendant, leaving scholars to puzzle over its meaning. But in recent years, modern linguists have made incredible strides in deciphering these ancient texts, revealing aspects of Etruscan life that had been lost for millennia. Recent discoveries are revealing more about the Etruscan language than we ever thought possible. While we still have many gaps, we're starting to decode key elements of their society, their politics, and their interactions with other cultures. The Etruscans were far more sophisticated than we previously understood, and this language is the key to unlocking their true history. What if the key to understanding the Etruscans' ultimate downfall and their profound influence on Rome lies within these unspoken words? As we peel back the layers of their language, we uncover the story of a civilization that was almost forgotten, yet whose legacy never truly disappeared. The Etruscans were not just a shadow of the past, they were the architects of Rome. Their art, their politics, their religion, and their very way of life were woven into the fabric of Rome's empire. But in the rise of Rome, how much of the Etruscan story was truly remembered, and how much was rewritten by the victors? The Etruscans may have vanished from the history books, but their legacy is still with us, woven into the very structure of Western civilization. The question remains, will we ever uncover the full truth of their forgotten empire?
The Etruscans may have vanished from the historical stage, their cities and power overtaken by the expanding Roman Empire.
But their legacy remains remarkably resilient, woven into the very fabric of the world we know today. The grandeur of their artistry, expressed in intricate bronze works, vivid frescoes, and elaborate tombs, continues to captivate and inspire. The temples and statues they created, the vibrant depictions of their daily life, and their deeply spiritual worldview not only influenced contemporary societies, but also set the stage for the Romans, whose civilization would dominate for centuries. The Etruscans' influence on Rome is undeniable. From their architectural innovations, such as the arch and the use of stone in monumental construction, to their contributions to Roman religious practices and governance. The very structure of the Roman Empire, from its political organization to its military strategies, bore the marks of Etruscan ingenuity. Even in their defeat, the Etruscans taught Rome the power of the gods, the importance of sacred rites, and the need for strong leadership, a legacy that shaped the future of the Western world.
Though the mysteries of their language continue to elude full understanding, the Etruscan script, their written words, inscribed on stone and pottery, still speaks to us across the ages, hinting at the vast knowledge that once defined their civilization. Archaeologists, linguists, and scholars continue to work tirelessly to unlock the secrets buried in ancient tombs and inscriptions, shedding light on a culture that was far more complex and sophisticated than often imagined. The Etruscan language may still be only partially deciphered, but the clues left behind reveal a society that was deeply attuned to the divine and the human, blending art, religion, and politics in ways that set the foundation for the empires that followed. The question is not just how the Etruscans disappeared, nor why their civilization eventually faded into history. It is instead about what they left behind, the enduring legacy of their culture, their innovations, and their way of life. The Etruscans may no longer exist as a distinct people, but their contributions to the world are still felt today. In their art, their architecture, their religious practices, and even in the structure of modern governance, the Etruscans continue to live on. As we unearth their artifacts and continue to piece together the fragments of their civilization, we realize that the Etruscans never truly vanished. They have left an indelible mark on the world, one that continues to shape our understanding of the ancient past and our view of the civilizations that came after them. Their legacy, hidden for centuries, is now being revealed, not just in museums or ancient ruins, but in the very way we build, govern, and understand the divine. In that legacy, the Etruscans live on, not as a forgotten people, but as the foundational architects of Western civilization. To uncover the past is to illuminate the path that shaped our present. The Etruscans did not just vanish. They live on in the shadows of history, waiting to be rediscovered.
The Etruscans' legacy continues to shape our world, yet so many still remain unaware of their profound influence. If you've been captivated by their story, don't let it fade into the background like so many others have. You've discovered just a glimpse of a civilization that's been hidden for centuries. Will you let their story end here, or will you share it with the world? Hit that subscribe button now and ensure the Etruscans' memory lives on, because if you don't, who will?